Welcome to Life Black Aspect, your ultimate destination for gripping storytelling. Dive into a world of suspense, drama, and intense emotions as we unravel captivating tales, focusing on wife-cheating horror stories and thrilling narratives that keep you on the edge of your seat. Whether you're here for shocking twists, chilling revelations, or thought-provoking plots, Life Black Aspect is your gateway to unforgettable storytelling experiences. Subscribe now and let the stories take over. From the moment I joined the service, I knew my life would be shaped by extremes, harsh landscapes, tough decisions, and the ever-present shadow of danger. I remember the sweltering heat of my first deployment, the way it clung to my skin and pressed down like an unrelenting weight. I had barely begun to grasp the enormity of the responsibility I had taken on, yet I was already learning the language of discipline and sacrifice. Days bled into weeks as my team and I trained, fought, and adapted to the unyielding demands of combat, our resolve forged in the fire of experience. Over the years, I developed a hardened focus, the kind that could only be earned by surviving where others fell. Each mission was a test of endurance and ingenuity, pushing the limits of what I thought possible. Yet it wasn't just the missions that shaped me. It was the camaraderie, the unspoken bond between brothers and sisters in arms. There was solace in knowing I wasn't alone, even in the loneliest corners of the world. These experiences made me who I was. On the night of that pivotal mission, as I sat aboard the roaring aircraft, ready to descend into the unknown, I looked down at the endless stretch of barren desert beneath us. Its silence was disrupted only by the constant, thunderous hum of the C-130 Hercules as it cut through the sky. The aircraft's clamor was a familiar companion, a sound as much a part of my reality as the gear strapped to my body. My team and I were seated in a rigid formation along the cabin walls, each of us focused on the meticulous ritual of checking and rechecking our equipment. It was another mission, on the surface, routine, but the weight of its implications hung heavy in the air. The cabin's red light switched to green. With a final adjustment to my oxygen mask, I joined the others as we moved to the ramp. One by one, we vanished into the night. Darkness enveloped us, the cold night air whipping around as we descended toward the earth. The jump went flawlessly. We drifted down like shadows, our black parachutes blending seamlessly with the starless sky. Touching down on the sand, I quickly detached my chute, shouldered my rifle, and scanned the horizon. A soft murmur in my earpiece confirmed the team was intact and in position. Our objective lay 5 kilometers away, a heavily fortified compound near Kandahar, believed to house a key insurgent leader. The stakes were high. Eliminating this figurehead could severely disrupt enemy operations. Every step forward was deliberate as we used the rugged terrain to stay concealed. The compound's high walls and sporadic guard towers loomed ahead as we split into 2 fire teams to approach from opposite sides. I led the right flank, ensuring every movement was precise. At exactly 0200 hours, we breached the perimeter with coordinated efficiency. Suppressed tools eliminated sentries before they could react, and the first phase was complete without incident. But the quiet didn't last. A sharp-eyed insurgent spotted movement and sounded the alarm. Chaos erupted as intense combat shattered the stillness, bullets ricocheting off walls and spraying dust into the air. Suppressive fire. I called into the comms, dropping to one knee to fire controlled bursts. My team responded instantly, providing cover as the second group pushed toward the main building. Inside, the compound was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and crude concrete rooms. We moved systematically, clearing each space as the defenders scrambled in disarray. Overpowered and unprepared, they didn't stand a chance. Reaching the final room, I recognized the target immediately. His face had been etched into my mind from countless briefings. He moved to grab a tool, but I reacted faster. One precise action, and it was over. Target down, I reported calmly, though my hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. We exited swiftly, slipping back into the shadows. Back into the desert we went, just as enemy reinforcements arrived, too late to save their leader. By the time we reached the extraction point, Dawn was painting the horizon with shades of orange and gold. Back at base, I replayed the mission in my mind, analyzing every decision, every moment. Then the commanding officer called me in. His rare smile caught me off guard as he handed over a folded piece of paper. "Morgan, you've earned this. You're going home." Home. The word felt surreal. Months away had made it almost a distant memory. Images of reunion videos flooded my mind. Soldiers surprising their families, dogs bounding with excitement, children crying or leaping into their parents' arms. I wanted that moment, that joy. I began planning right away. The idea was simple but meaningful. I'd quietly slip into the house and surprise them, maybe during dinner or while they were watching TV. I could already see Linda's expression, her hands flying to her face in shock before she ran to embrace me. I pictured Oscar freezing for a second before breaking into a grin, older now but still my boy, leaping into my arms. And Butch, my loyal German shepherd, charging toward me, barking and wagging his tail like a propeller, trying to knock me over in excitement. The flight home felt like an eternity. Each mile brought me closer to them, Linda, Oscar, and Butch. The anticipation was nearly unbearable. I rehearsed the moment over and over, imagining their reactions and the pure joy of being reunited. Finally, I arrived. The house looked just as I remembered. White siding, blue shutters, the familiar porch where Linda loved to sip her morning coffee. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nerves as I stood in the driveway. It was time to go inside, to leave behind the months of separation and reclaim the life I had been longing for. I parked silently and pulled out my phone, pressing record. "Time to surprise the family," I whispered, forcing a smile at the camera. "Let's see if Butch still remembers me." The porch creaked softly beneath my footsteps. Under my boots, the porch creaked softly as I stepped toward the front door. I called for Butch, expecting to hear the familiar sound of paws scrambling on the floor or a bark echoing through the house. Instead, there was only silence. Frowning, I stepped inside. The living room looked exactly as it should. Oscar's backpack was slung on the floor near the couch, and a half-empty glass of juice sat on the coffee table. It felt lived in, familiar, yet something about the stillness seemed off. I called out again, louder this time, but still no response. My chest tightened as I moved cautiously through the house, my boots muffled on the carpet. I was heading toward the kitchen when I froze. Muffled voices drifted from the bedroom, soft laughter, followed by a man's voice mixing with Linda's. My pulse quickened, and the phone in my hand shook as I slowly approached the partially open door. My heart pounded, each step heavier than the last, until I reached the door and nudged it open. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Linda, my wife, was in bed with another man. He was shirtless, his tattooed back glistening with sweat. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, my mind unable to process the scene before me. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. Rage surged through me. I lunged, grabbing the man by the shoulders and yanking him off the bed. He stumbled, disoriented, as I swung, my fist connecting with his face, his ribs, his jaw, fueled by pure anger. He tried to resist, but I was stronger, angrier, relentless. "Stop it, Richard." Linda's panicked voice broke through the chaos. She grabbed at my arms, tears streaking her face. "You're going to kill him." But I couldn't stop. All I could see was the betrayal, the man in my house, in my bed with my wife. My knuckles struck again and again until Linda threw herself between us, forcing me back. "You said," collapsed to the floor, groaning high. The man collapsed to the floor, groaning, his face swollen and bruised. Linda knelt beside him, shielding him as though protecting him from a monster. "You're insane," she screamed, her voice cracking. The sound of sirens cut through the haze of rage, growing louder with every passing second. A neighbor must have called the cops. The wail of the approaching cars jolted me slightly back to reality. I stepped away from the battered man, my chest heaving, my fists trembling, dark stains smeared across them. The front door burst open, and officers stormed in. Among them was Vince Parker, a childhood friend I hadn't seen in years. His expression shifted from shock to something heavier as he took in the scene, me standing there, fists bloodied, the man groaning on the floor, and Linda sobbing. "Rich," he said softly, stepping toward me, his voice barely audible. "Don't make this harder." I raised my hands slowly, military training kicking in. "Do what you have to," I muttered, my voice cold and steady. Vince sighed, almost apologetically, as he cuffed my wrists. "I'll fix this," he whispered. But I said nothing. What could he possibly fix? My life had unraveled in an instant, and no words could undo it. As they led me out, I locked eyes with Linda. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her expression a mixture of guilt and anguish. She knew the damage she had done, but I had nothing left to say to her. My gaze dropped to the man on the floor, the one who had the nerve to smirk through his swollen face. A fresh wave of anger swelled inside me, but I kept my mouth shut. "Start counting days," I said coldly, my voice low and unyielding, before walking out the door. The fluorescent lights of the holding cell buzzed softly as I sat on the bench, staring at my bruised knuckles. My mind raced, replaying everything, every word, every punch, every moment that had led me here. Just hours ago, I had been planning a joyous reunion. Now, I was sitting in a cell, my life turned inside out, with nothing but silence and regret. The officer unlocked the cell door, handing over a phone for a single call. Without hesitation, I contacted my commanding officer, explaining the situation and seeking his help. He assured me that his daughter, Melissa, a skilled lawyer, was on her way to handle things. When Melissa arrived, her presence was immediately commanding, confident and composed. She wasted no time understanding the events that had unfolded. I explained everything, from my unexpected return home to the betrayal I had discovered and the resulting altercation. She listened intently, taking notes and assessing the situation. Her initial findings were sobering. My wife had already testified against me and filed a restraining order, a move that raised more questions than answers. Melissa was determined to uncover how it had happened so quickly and vowed to fight on my behalf. The next day, I found myself in court, still in uniform. The sterile, cold atmosphere was a stark contrast to the battlefields I knew, yet the stakes felt just as high. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features, scrutinized the case closely. Her questioning revealed her disdain, particularly regarding the injuries I had inflicted on Luke Brown, the man I had found in my home. I explained my actions with calm precision, recounting how I had perceived a threat in that moment. My years of training had conditioned me to act decisively, but my intent had not been to kill, only to neutralize a perceived danger. While my explanation was factual, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Melissa remained steadfast, her professionalism unwavering despite the challenges. The weight of the accusations and the reality of my situation loomed large, but I resolved to face it with the same discipline I had carried throughout my military service. The judge called the prosecution to proceed, and Linda took the stand. Her demeanor was cold and detached. She avoided my gaze, refusing to meet my eyes. My gaze as she calmly explained her actions, dismissing our years together. She described Luke Brown as a supportive friend who had stepped in to meet her needs during my long absences. With calculated precision, she announced that she had filed for divorce earlier that day, making it clear that this was part of a well-orchestrated plan. Luke was next. He approached the stand with smug confidence, painting himself as the reliable presence Linda needed in my absence. His words were deliberate, each one stinging like a fresh wound, designed to provoke me. Melissa's firm grip on my arm kept me grounded as the urge to react boiled within me. The prosecution then called Vincent Parker, the officer who had arrested me. Vince's testimony struck a different tone. He described my cooperation during the arrest and presented evidence from my phone, a video recording of my return home. The footage clearly showed my shock at finding Luke in my house and my immediate reaction, driven by the belief that Linda was in danger. Despite the clarity of the evidence, Judge Brenda Smith's disdain was palpable. She addressed me with a tone dripping in condescension, emphasizing that my military background did not excuse my actions. She accused me of arrogance, dismissing my instincts as reckless. Her words felt like an attack on my service and character, as if Linda's betrayal was somehow justified by my absence. The judge's remarks were a slap in the face. She framed my deployment as neglect, minimizing my sacrifices while justifying Linda's actions. Frustration boiled over, and I stood, slamming my hands on the table. My voice rose, cutting through the courtroom silence as I called out the absurdity of her reasoning. I questioned whether my service to the country and my orders from the president were to blame for my marriage's collapse, pushing the mockery to its limit. The tension in the room was electric, and the judge's face flushed with anger. Her response was swift and cold, sentencing me to 3 months in prison for contempt of court. The gavel's echo sealed the verdict, leaving the room in stunned silence. In stunned silence, I stood tall, my chest heaving with controlled breaths. Meeting her gaze one last time, I spoke with quiet resolve. "Start counting." Then, without another word, I turned and faced the consequences, refusing to let her see me broken. Time seemed to pause as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session. The judge rose without a glance in my direction, her dismissal final and sharp. The guards escorted me back to my cell, their footsteps echoing through the corridor before the heavy door slammed shut behind me. I stood motionless, absorbing the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of inmates. This was my new reality, a battlefield of steel and concrete. Melissa's scolding echoed in my mind. She had berated me for my courtroom outburst, accusing me of throwing away a chance to build a solid defense. Her disappointment was evident, but I had already resigned myself to this outcome. The system had made its decision, and I wasn't going to grovel for understanding. The first days in the cell block were a test. Inmates measured me with every glance, guards mocked me with a nickname, Captain America, and the air was thick with tension. The challenge came quickly. A man called Big Red confronted me in the yard. He was built like a boulder, his tattoos adding to his intimidating presence. His challenge was clear, but I didn't waste words. The fight ended swiftly. A precise elbow to his gut, a leg sweep, and a forearm to his throat. Word spread fast. By the third day, no one else dared to test me. One afternoon, a guard banged on my cell door and informed me of a visitor. At first, I assumed it was Melissa, ready to lecture me again, but when he mentioned Linda's name, my stomach churned. I debated refusing, but curiosity won. In the visiting area, Linda entered with an air of composure, wearing a sundress I didn't recognize, likely something Luke had picked out. Linda sat across from me, her voice casual and smug as she recounted how Luke had moved in with his son, Brandon. She described her life as complete, her words cutting deeper than any insult. I stayed silent, letting her dig herself into the grave she seemed eager to build. She mistook my silence for defeat, smirking as she claimed that life had a way of working out. I smiled back, a cold, venomous smile, and leaned forward. My voice was low but deliberate as I told her to keep counting, because payback was inevitable. Her smirk faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly, rising from the chair with unsettling calm. As she turned to leave, she delivered one final blow. "Oh, and Butch is dead." Her words struck like a knife. I froze, disbelief flashing across my face. She explained without emotion, claiming the dog had tried to bite Luke. Her decision to have him euthanized was delivered as casually as if she had discarded an old pair of shoes. Rage surged, but I held it back. Rising to my feet, I simply said, "Add it to the list. And don't stop counting." Then, without another glance, I turned and walked away. The days inside blended into a relentless rhythm of workouts and vigilance. Each second crawled by, but I marked them all, counting down to the day I would walk out. One day at a time, I prepared for what would come next. About a week into my sentence, Vince showed up unannounced. The guard called my name, and I didn't hesitate. It was a relief to see a familiar face, someone who didn't see me as just another inmate. In the visitation room, Vince looked different, worn down like he was carrying a weight too heavy to shake. He leaned in, speaking low to avoid being overheard. While he admitted he couldn't help me legally, he hinted at another way. He had people, ones who owed him favors and were willing to assist once I was out. His words carried weight. Vince wasn't one to make empty promises. I nodded, trusting his judgment. Time dragged on, but I stayed out of trouble, waiting for the day I'd walk free. It finally came, the day I walked free. Vince was there, waiting in his car. The ride to his place was quiet. He wasn't much for small talk, and neither was I. His house reflected the man himself, simple, functional, and empty of any personal touch. Over drinks, he opened up, sharing a story I hadn't expected. Years ago, his wife had cheated on him. Back then, as a cop, he had felt helpless against a system that didn't care about his pain. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable as he recounted how the courts and the system had let him down. He saw himself in me, the same anger, the same betrayal. Arresting me, he admitted, had been a reminder of his own scars. Now, he didn't want me to endure the same downward spiral. Vince made a few calls, his tone clipped and efficient. Soon, a car pulled up outside, and 3 men stepped inside, each bringing a distinct presence to the room. Vince introduced them one by one, their stories as heavy as their reputations. First was Nate, a towering, muscular figure who had once been a bar bouncer. He had intervened to protect a woman from an entitled rich kid, an act of integrity that cost him everything. The kid's influential father ensured Nate took the fall, leading to a prison sentence. During his time inside, Nate's mother passed away from cancer. Vince, unable to save her, carried guilt alongside Nate's loss. Next was Mario, a wiry man with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. A tech genius, he had once exposed corruption at his company, naively trusting the system. Instead, that same system framed him for fraud, sending him to prison for 5 years. Now, he used his skills as a hacker, his quiet demeanor masking a brilliant mind. Finally, there was Chuck, a short, heavy-set man who seemed out of place among the others. His friendly demeanor was deceptive. He was a chemistry prodigy turned meth cook in his youth. Success brought attention, and a tip-off landed him in prison. Despite his past, Vince vouched for his expertise, insisting that Chuck's skills could be invaluable. As I took in these unlikely allies, Vince's plan began to unfold. The plan became clearer, but frustration simmered beneath the surface. Pulling Vince aside, I questioned the necessity of involving others. My instincts screamed to handle things myself, to face my enemies directly, and reclaim what was mine. But Vince's steady gaze stopped me short. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about ensuring I survived the battles ahead. Vince's laugh rang out, loud and clear, the kind of laugh that told me he'd heard it all before. He shook his head, almost amused by my anger, and spelled it out for me. If I went through with my plan, I'd end up back in jail. Meanwhile, Linda would still be living with her lover, using my money, while I rotted behind bars. He made it painfully clear that this wasn't the solution I was looking for. I ran a hand through my hair, frustration building inside me, but Vince wasn't done. He reminded me of the one thing I hadn't stopped to think about, my son, still a minor. He said my son still needed me to make the right decisions. Vince told me to stay out of the light, to let the professionals handle it. Then, he dropped another bombshell. Linda hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she had broken the law by moving her lover and his kid into my house. That hit me hard. I'd been so blinded by rage, I hadn't fully grasped the depth of what was happening. The next morning, I knew I had to take control. The anger was still there, but my mind was sharp and focused. I called my mom and laid everything out for her. I didn't even need to explain much. She wasn't surprised. She had always seen through Linda, and now her warnings made all the sense in the world. I need your help, I told her, and she didn't hesitate. The house was hers, and I needed her to step in and take it back. Linda had turned it into her playground, and I wasn't going to let that continue. My mom agreed immediately, saying she'd send the notice for Linda to leave. There was no hesitation in her voice, only resolve. That gave me a strange sense of relief. Then came the call I had been expecting. Linda's number popped up on the screen. I answered, ready for what I knew was coming.
She didn't disappoint.
Her voice was a mix of venom and fury, throwing insults and accusations at me like daggers. I stayed silent, letting her scream until her anger started to run out of steam. When her tone shifted to pleading, I knew she was trying a new angle. She begged, saying our son needed the house and that I was being unfair to him. I kept my voice steady and unemotional, telling her the truth. It wasn't my house, the owner wanted it back, and there was nothing more to say. I didn't give her time to respond. I ended the call and let the silence on her end speak for itself. That evening, I sat across from Mario in Vince's cramped, dimly lit living room. Mario was the guy for the kind of work I needed. I explained my plan. I wanted access to Linda's phone and her lover's. I wanted everything, texts, emails, photos, any dirt I could use. Mario didn't flinch. He raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by how far I was willing to go, and asked if I was sure. I'm sure, I replied, more sure than I'd ever been about anything. They had taken everything from me, and now it was my turn to take something from them. Mario led me to his workspace, a tiny room crowded with wires and glowing monitors. The place hummed with the sound of machinery, and he looked completely at home there. He explained the process in simple terms, an email, a link, and then a bot that would give him full access to their phones. It was straightforward, and he worked fast, his hands flying across the keyboard. Now we wait, he said, hitting the final key and sending the emails. He told me it could take minutes or hours, depending on how long it took for their curiosity to get the better of them, but he was confident they would click. Later that night, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mario. I'm in. Collecting dirt. The first step in my revenge was complete. The following day, my phone buzzed again with an incoming call. Glancing at the screen, I recognized the number. Instantly bracing myself, I answered, knowing this wasn't going to be a casual chat. Colonel Walker's voice came through, firm but heavy, the tone he used when things were serious. He told me that higher-ups, far above the usual chain of command, were making noise about my recent courtroom outburst. Apparently, my mention of suing the president had struck a nerve. It wasn't just talk anymore. It had become a headline that had ruffled feathers in powerful places. I listened in silence, my jaw tightening as I processed his words. Walker, someone who'd always valued my directness, admitted I'd walked into something much larger than I realized. Challenges to authority, especially public ones, didn't sit well in those circles. Before he could say more, I cut in, making my decision clear. I would resign. It was the only way to prevent the fallout from spreading to others. Walker pushed back, but I wouldn't budge. My career had already been overshadowed by this mess, and it was better to step away than drag my service and reputation through the mud. The pause on his end told me he understood, though he didn't like it. With a tinge of regret in his voice, he promised to push for an honorable discharge, acknowledging my years of dedicated service. I thanked him genuinely before the line went dead. Staring at the phone, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. My military career, something I'd poured my life into, was over. That evening, a knock at the door broke my thoughts. Mario strolled in, grinning like he just hit the jackpot. He carried a flash drive in one hand and his laptop under his arm. With his signature swagger, he declared he had everything I'd asked for, and then some. Curious but cautious, I watched as he plugged the drive into his laptop. The screen lit up with folders neatly labeled, and Mario's grin widened as he began to explain. There was enough incriminating material here to destroy both Linda and her lover Luke. Explicit texts, emails, and more. Videos painted a sordid picture of their relationship, but that wasn't all. Mario revealed something darker: Luke's involvement in pill trafficking. He wasn't a kingpin but acted as a transporter, moving small quantities for a network that included cops and judges. That kind of protection explained why he'd managed to operate under the radar for so long. I leaned in, absorbing every detail as Mario broke it down. He had spent hours organizing the data into folders, one for the affair, another for the pill dealings, and a third for everything else. I thanked him for his thoroughness, and he assured me that everything was securely backed up in multiple locations. He handed me the password, a complex mix of symbols and letters, urging me to memorize it and destroy the paper. As I held the key to their destruction in my hands, Mario's parting words echoed in my mind. This information was dynamite. He was right, I knew it, and I also knew exactly how I would use it. Meanwhile, at the house, Linda's frustration boiled over. She paced the living room, her anger sharp and vocal as she ranted about being forced out. To her, this was an unforgivable betrayal, and she didn't bother hiding her disdain for my mother, who owned the property. Luke, ever the calm opportunist, leaned back and shrugged off her tirade. He assured her they'd find a way to fix things. When she snapped at him for his nonchalance, he simply smirked and pulled out his phone. His tone turned colder as he told her not to worry. The problem would be dealt with soon. Linda froze, her anger giving way to confusion as she pressed him for an explanation. Luke avoided specifics, brushing off her questions as he scrolled through his contacts. Walking to a family photo of me and my mother, he glanced at it before dialing. When the call connected, his voice dropped, and he spoke in code. It was clear he was giving someone instructions, details about what he called a cleanup, after sending a text. Presumably with my mother's picture, Luke returned to the living room, his smirk intact. Linda's suspicion deepened, but he brushed it off again, telling her it was handled. Her unease was evident, but Luke's confidence was unwavering. He leaned back, relaxed, while Linda stood frozen, unsure of what she had just witnessed. As much as she hated my mother, something about Luke's calm promise unsettled her. Mario's surveillance system detected a critical phone call through its keyword algorithm. The device began to beep, prompting Mario to investigate. Realizing the severity of what he'd intercepted, he grabbed his laptop and quickly brought it to where I was sitting with Vince. He showed us a recorded phone call extracted from Luke's device. The audio revealed Luke discussing my mother, Michelle Morgan, by name. He mentioned sending her photo to someone. It became instantly clear that Luke wasn't bluffing. He had taken steps to target my mother. Mario confirmed the photo had been sent to a known criminal, making the threat disturbingly real. The weight of the situation hit hard. Vince immediately recognized the urgency, stating the need for fast action to protect my mother. Mario was already tracking the recipient of the call, working as quickly as possible, but time wasn't on our side. Without hesitation, I armed myself and prepared to act. Vince instinctively reached for his radio to alert his department, but I stopped him, knowing Luke's influence extended to local law enforcement. We couldn't risk involving compromised officers. Vince understood the danger and agreed to handle it independently. Together, we raced to my mother's house. Though the drive was only minutes long, every second felt excruciating. When we arrived, we parked a few houses away to remain unnoticed. I called my mother, instructing her to secure the doors, avoid answering for anyone, and immediately contact emergency services to report an attempted break-in. My mother, quick-witted and composed, assured me she understood before ending the call. From our concealed position, we watched as a figure approached the house. The man moved deliberately, slipping into the shadows near the front entrance. Vince's radio crackled with the report of a potential break-in at the address. As the nearest officer on duty, Vince responded and drove to the house, pulling into the driveway without activating his siren to avoid tipping off the intruder. Before exiting the vehicle, Vince made it clear that I was to stay behind. He activated his body camera and proceeded toward the house. From inside the car, I could hear Vince's commanding voice ordering the suspect to disarm. Moments later, a chaotic scuffle ensued. Furniture toppled, and 3 sharp cracks shattered the stillness of the neighborhood. My heart pounded as I gripped the edge of the seat, straining to see through the dim light. Vince emerged from the house a short time later, calm and collected. He reported over the radio that the armed suspect had been neutralized and requested medical support. Returning to the car, he conveyed the situation with a measured demeanor, confirming the threat had been eliminated. Relief washed over me, though the gravity of what had happened lingered heavily. Later that evening, we regrouped to assess the broader situation. Vince emphasized the importance of swiftly dismantling Luke's network before they could strike again. Chuck, who had been monitoring Luke's activities, provided key details about an upcoming pill delivery in 3 days. Luke was set to transport a package from a downtown pickup point to a contact on Maple Drive. Chuck revealed that this contact was the same individual who had betrayed his previous operation to law enforcement. With this knowledge, Chuck had been tracking Luke and his associates, waiting for an opportunity to expose them. He outlined the importance of intercepting this delivery, explaining that doing so would disrupt their entire operation. The team agreed that the plan required precision and urgency. Detailed intel and Vince's strategic oversight made it clear that we had one opportunity to get this right. For me, the stakes were deeply personal. Luke had crossed every line, and this was our chance to bring him and his criminal dealings to an end. I waited in my car, parked discreetly just off the main road, my eyes fixed on every passing vehicle. Everything hinged on this moment. Chuck had laid out the route Luke would take, and all the preparations were in place. My pulse quickened as I scanned the road, ready to act. Soon I spotted it, a car matching Chuck's description. My grip tightened on my phone as I made the call, delivering the signal to Vince. Moments later, the roar of Vince's engine cut through the stillness as his car surged forward, its siren screaming. I watched as Luke's car approached, and Vince gave chase. The pursuit quickly escalated. Luke's car accelerated, the sound of its tires gripping the asphalt barely audible over the wail of the sirens. Vince stayed close, refusing to let him escape. The situation took a sudden, violent turn. Luke's car swerved, its tires screeching before losing control entirely. It spun wildly, fishtailing before skidding off the road. My breath caught as I watched the car flip repeatedly, one roll, then another and another, until it came to rest on its side, a mangled heap of metal and shattered glass. I slammed my car into gear and sped toward the wreck, my chest pounding. Arriving first on the scene, I jumped out and raced to the vehicle. The destruction was worse up close, glass scattered everywhere, the frame crumpled beyond recognition. Vince was already there, wrenching the door open with focused determination. He worked quickly, pulling the driver free and dragging them to safety. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. The driver wasn't Luke. It was his son, Alistair. The boy, no older than 19, was pale and bleeding profusely. Vince moved with urgency, calling for medics as he tried to stabilize him, but it was clear Alistair's condition was dire.
You said, dire.
His breaths were shallow, and his unfocused eyes hinted at the inevitable. My chest tightened as I realized there was nothing anyone could do. By the time the paramedics arrived, Alistair was gone. Later, I stood across the street from the police station, watching as Luke walked out on bail. His smug demeanor only fueled my anger. He shamelessly shifted the blame onto his dead son, claiming ignorance of the pills in the car. His brazenness was infuriating, but it was his indifference to AL's death that made my rage boil. Luke had lost a son, yet he treated it as nothing more than an inconvenience. As he left the station, his eyes met mine across the crowd. He didn't seem surprised to see me there, and his expression shifted to a confident smirk as he approached. He stopped in front of me, his posture radiating arrogance. My voice was low and sharp as I confronted him, warning him of the consequences of his actions. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, though he quickly masked it. Stepping closer, I left him with a final warning, one that hung heavily in the air. This wasn't over. My thoughts drifted to my own son, Oscar, whom I hadn't seen in months. Linda had made sure to sever any line of communication, leaving me completely in the dark about his well-being. The helplessness gnawed at me daily, the uncertainty eating away at my resolve. Desperate for answers, I confided in Vince, recounting my confrontation with Luke and my fears for Oscar's safety. Vince listened intently, his expression hardening with every word. When I finished, he spoke with quiet determination, vowing to end the chaos once and for all. He wasted no time making calls to set things in motion. His first call was to Nate, tasking him with tracking Oscar. Vince insisted on a cautious approach, emphasizing the importance of keeping the search discreet to avoid drawing attention. Protecting Oscar was the top priority. Vince contacted Mario, instructing him to compile every piece of evidence against Luke, the corrupt officers, and the compromised judges. The files were to be sent directly to the FBI and media outlets, ensuring the truth would come to light. There would be no more hiding or protecting Luke's criminal network. Finally, Vince reached out to Chuck. The plan was clear. Pills would be planted in Linda's car. It wasn't a decision that required discussion. Vince knew it was the leverage needed to force her hand. The final step was to involve Child Protective Services. If there was any hope of protecting Oscar and putting an end to the chaos, this was the way forward. Every move Vince made was calculated, designed to dismantle Luke's web of lies and ensure justice was served. The morning began with a call from Vince, his voice calm but purposeful as he informed me the plan was underway. Chuck and Nate were tailing Linda as she went about her routine, every movement carefully tracked. For me, the hours dragged on endlessly as I waited for news, hoping against hope that this would bring me closer to Oscar. Finally, my phone buzzed, snapping me out of my restless thoughts. Had arrived at a house on Pine Cove, Vince explained. Chuck and Nate had spotted her going inside, and with her was Oscar. The mention of my son's name sent a surge of adrenaline through me. After months of agony and uncertainty, Oscar was within reach. Every instinct screamed at me to rush to that house to take him back right then and there, but I couldn't jeopardize the operation. Vince and his team had a plan, and I needed to trust them. Outside the house, Chuck and Nate observed Linda disappear through the front door, oblivious to their presence. Nate approached her car with an air of nonchalance, while Chuck followed closely, clutching a small bag that would ultimately seal her fate. In a practice motion, Nate ensured the area was clear. Before gently opening the car door, Chuck placed the bag strategically somewhere discreet, but impossible to miss during a thorough search. The two walked away without looking back, their movements smooth and calculated. Moments later, Nate dialed emergency from a burner phone, reporting the suspicious vehicle. Vince was the closest officer to respond, his calm and commanding presence enough to disarm any situation. I imagined him stepping into action with his usual efficiency. He alerted both Child Protective Services and dispatch, ensuring that every angle was covered. Then, armed with paperwork to maintain appearances, Vince entered the house. Inside, Linda's arrogant demeanor likely faltered as Vince informed her of her arrest. I could picture her initial defiance, the sneer on her face twisting into disbelief as the reality of the situation set in. But Vince wasn't the type to tolerate resistance, and the arrest was swift and methodical. Meanwhile, agents from Child Protective Services moved past Linda's protests to assess the environment and ultimately Oscar's safety. The moment I'd been waiting for finally came when Vince called to tell me that Oscar was safe and on his way to me. Relief and anger clashed inside me as I gripped the phone, every emotion I'd suppressed over the past months threatening to overwhelm me. When the agents brought Oscar to me, the sight of him nearly undid me. His expression held confusion and fear, but when his eyes met mine, recognition flickered there. The moment they handed him over, I held him close, the weight of months of separation dissolving into relief. Later, back in my mom's house, I pieced together why Linda and Luke had hidden Oscar in that house. They were trying to alienate him from me, laying the groundwork to claim I'd abandoned him. The restraining order and my time in jail had given them the opportunity to create a false narrative, one they hoped would hold up in court. But none of that mattered now. Oscar was with me. That evening, while Oscar found safety at my mom's house, Vince called with grim news. Linda had made bail. The timing sent a chill through me, but Vince reassured me that the FBI had received the incriminating documents and was already moving forward. However, the relief was short-lived. Later that night, Vince called again, his voice tense with urgency. Mario had intercepted a call revealing that Linda and Luke were headed to my mother's house. Vince and his team were en route, but until they arrived, it was up to me to keep Oscar safe. I instructed my mom to take Oscar upstairs to the main bedroom, lock the door, and open it only for me or Vince. Her pale but determined face reassured me as she ushered Oscar away. Alone in the darkened living room, I turned off every light, Glock in hand, and waited. The minutes dragged on like hours, my senses heightened with every faint sound. The kitchen doorknob jiggled, breaking the silence. My pulse quickened as I moved behind the dining table, crouching low. The door creaked open, revealing the bulky silhouette of Luke, rifle in hand. He stepped inside menacingly. Moments later, Linda followed, her tool glinting faintly in the dim light. Their desperation was evident, choosing this reckless, armed confrontation over a legal battle. It spoke to their desperation and arrogance. I crept forward, each step deliberate and silent. When I was directly behind Luke, I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The room flooded with light, and in one swift motion, I pressed the barrel of my Glock against Luke's neck. My voice was steady, low, and unyielding as I issued my ultimatum. The tension in the room was palpable, but I wasn't backing down. Luke's rifle wavered slightly in his grip, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. This time, I wasn't letting him, or anyone else, hurt my family. Luke froze, his face draining. Luke's face drained of color as his wide eyes locked onto mine. He must have seen it, the unwavering resolve, the fury burning just beneath the surface, and the complete absence of fear. His grip loosened, and the rifle slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Linda, still holding her tool, her hands trembling as she aimed it at me. I turned my attention to her, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Her knuckles whitened as she hesitated, fear and defiance warring in her expression. After what felt like an eternity, she finally let the Colt drop, nudging it toward me with a hesitant push of her foot. I kept my focus locked on them, scooping up the tool while keeping the rifle in sight. With both tools in my hands, I demanded answers. Luke remained silent, his jaw clenched tight, but Linda's ragged breaths and darting eyes gave her away. It didn't take long before Luke finally spoke, his words chilling in their bluntness. He admitted they had come to liquidate me and my mother, planning to burn the house down to cover their tracks. His tone was cold, almost casual, as if it were a simple task to erase lives. The rage building inside me was almost too much to contain. I glared at them, disbelief mingling with fury. When Linda's composure cracked, she erupted into a stream of venomous threats. She swore she'd take Oscar for me in court, painting me as an unfit father. Her words were sharp, laced with malice, but it was her final accusation that struck the hardest, blaming me for Alistair's death. Luke, calmer but no less dangerous, stepped forward. His tone was laced with malice, as he vowed I'd know the pain of losing a son. His words were icy and deliberate. The audacity of their threats ignited something deep and primal within me. My vision narrowed, the sound of their voices fading into a low hum as everything else fell away. Lowering the tool, I reached for the rifle Luke had dropped. Its weight felt heavy and final as I checked the chamber, 2 shells loaded and ready. I snapped it shut. The sound of the rifle shot echoed in the tense silence. Linda's face went pale, and her breaths came in sharp gasps. Luke stood frozen, his false bravado stripped away and replaced by unmistakable fear. My voice was calm and measured as I locked eyes with him. He had come here to take everything from me, but the tables had turned. With unflinching precision, I raised the rifle and fired. The blast was deafening, smoke and burnt residue filling the air. Luke's body crumpled, the force of the impact throwing him back. He lay motionless, his chest torn open, the life gone from his eyes. I turned to Linda, her tear-streaked face a mask of terror. She shook her head, muttering desperate pleas that grew louder as panic overtook her. I took a step closer, the rifle steady in my grip. Her cries fell on deaf ears. This wasn't about mercy, it was about justice for what they had done to my family. Her words blended into a distant echo as I pulled the trigger again. Another deafening blast, then silence. Sinking onto the couch, I rested the rifle across my lap. The acrid scent of smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the ringing in my ears. My thoughts raced, a storm of emotions threatening to pull me under. The creak of the front door snapped me back to reality. Vince stepped inside, his sharp eyes taking in the scene, the bodies, the shattered quiet of my home. Without hesitation, he headed upstairs to check on my mom and Oscar. Moments later, he escorted them outside, shielding Oscar's eyes from the chaos. When he returned, his expression was a mix of grim resolve and faint satisfaction. He stood over me, his voice low but steady as he assured me the situation was under control. Vince made a few calls, summoning reinforcements to clean up the scene. While waiting, he shared updates. Judge Brenda Smith, who had been lenient with Luke's associates, was now in custody. The noose was tightening around the remaining corrupt figures in Luke's network, each piece falling into place. Vince brought a semblance of order to the chaos, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and offering a grim reminder. They came into your home with intent to liquidate. You're a Navy SEAL. You defended yourself, took control of the tool, and neutralized the threat. That's the report, and you stick to it. Not a word more, not a word less. I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. Vince was my anchor in this storm, his presence a steady reminder that justice, however messy, had finally been served. A few minutes later, I found myself stepping into the police station, every detail around me feeling distant and unreal, as if I were moving through a haze. Vince handed me a stack of papers to sign, and I barely glanced at them, trusting him to handle the particulars. My hand moved mechanically, my thoughts elsewhere. The next thing I knew, I was back in Vince's car, the low hum of the engine filling the silence between us. He didn't say much on the drive, only giving me a glance now and then. When we reached my house, he finally spoke, his tone steady and firm, telling me to get some rest. I nodded, stepping out of the car. Vince waited until I was inside before pulling away. 2 weeks later, I received a call from my commanding officer. His voice was neutral, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He informed me that an honorable discharge had been secured. It wasn't how I envisioned leaving the service, but I knew better than to protest. He asked me to come in to finalize the paperwork. Driving to the base one last time, I felt the bittersweet pull of familiarity. The hallways, once alive with purpose and camaraderie, now felt strangely hollow. Memories of shared hardships and victories flickered through my mind, mingling with the sting of recent events. In his office, my CO greeted me with his usual imposing presence, though there was something softer in his demeanor. As I signed the final documents, he watched me closely, arms crossed. When I finished, he spoke in a quieter tone than I'd ever heard. He acknowledged the disruption my courtroom outburst had caused. Admitting that my actions had unsettled those in power, my commanding officer also shared that many had admired what I did, even if they couldn't say so openly. His words hit me differently, leaving me at a loss for a response. We shook hands, and I walked out, knowing it was the last time I would see those walls. Outside, I headed toward my car, a swirl of relief and regret settling in my chest. One chapter of my life had ended, and another was waiting to begin. When I got home, Oscar was standing at the door, his face lighting up the second he saw me. He bolted toward me, wrapping his arms around my waist in a hug that drove away every dark thought. As I held him close, something small and energetic darted out from behind him, a German Shepherd puppy, tail wagging so furiously it was a blur. The pup bounded up to me, leaping and licking my hands with sloppy enthusiasm. Oscar's laugh was infectious, and I found myself laughing with him. When I asked where the little guy had come from, Oscar explained with a grin that Mario had dropped him off, claiming I needed a new partner. That evening, I met up with Nate, Mario, and Chuck at a bar. The four of us shared drinks, swapping stories and jabs, the tension of the past weeks finally giving way to laughter. The bar settled into its usual rhythm, the clink of glasses and hum of conversation creating a rare sense of normalcy. We were halfway through another round when a shadow loomed over the table. Looking up, I recognized a towering figure immediately. It was Ralph, his broad shoulders practically blocking out the overhead light. His weathered face broke into a grin as he greeted me like a long-lost brother. The force of his hug nearly knocked the air out of me, but I didn't mind. I introduced him to the others, explaining Ralph's reputation as the Wrecker, a demolitions expert who had worked with SEAL teams countless times. The group sized him up with curiosity and respect as he sat down, the chair groaning under his weight. I slid a fresh beer across the table, and we caught up briefly. Then Vince arrived, sliding into the seat next to me, looking between us. Asking if he'd missed anything, Ralph's face turned uncharacteristically serious. In a low voice, he told us about a Mexican pill lord known as the Soup Maker. His name alone silenced the table. Mario froze mid-sip, his usual smirk vanishing, and Nate and Chuck exchanged grim looks, clearly recognizing the name. Vince looked puzzled, the only one out of the loop. Ralph explained he'd been tracking the Soup Maker for months and had followed him here. His voice was calm but resolute as he told us he wasn't looking for backup. He was looking for a team, people he could trust to help him and the Soup Maker for good. The gravity of his words hung in the air, and I knew this wasn't just another mission. It was personal for Ralph, and now it was personal for us too. As I watched Ralph outline the details of his mission, a quiet resolve settled over me. The room was heavy with tension, each of us processing what this meant. My gaze drifted to the frothy beer on the table, the condensation tracing slow paths down the glass, as if marking the fleeting moments of calm we had left. The Soup Maker. Even saying the name felt like invoking something ancient and unrelenting. Ralph's reputation preceded him. If he said this was serious, then it was. Yet, a part of me, tempered by loss and betrayal, felt oddly at peace. This, at least, was a battle I could control. No blurred lines, no false allies, just a clear enemy and a shared purpose. Mario broke the silence first, his voice tinged with reluctant humor. You know, I just got comfortable, Ralph, and here you are dragging me back into the fire. He grinned, but his eyes betrayed his apprehension. Nate, ever the stoic, simply nodded. If Ralph says it's worth it, I'm in. No questions asked. Chuck hesitated, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a pensive frown. I ain't built for heroics, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Chuck hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, but then spoke. I ain't built for heroics, but if it means putting the Soup Maker guy out of commission, count me in. Vince leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his calculated gaze locked on Ralph. You sure you want to go this route? You could pull in any number of teams. Why us? Ralph's reply was simple, yet it struck deep. Because I trust you, and trust is all that matters out there. As he spoke, I felt the familiar pull of duty, a deep, instinctual drive honed over years of service. It was a strange kind of gravity, pulling me toward action, even as part of me longed to stay anchored in the fragile peace I had just started to build. I'm in, I said, my voice steady. All eyes turned to me, not just because Ralph asked, but because I needed this. I needed to remember what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. Ralph's eyes softened, and he nodded. The room shifted. The unspoken bond between us solidified. This wasn't just a team, it was a family forged in the fires of shared pain and purpose. As the night wore on, plans began to form, maps were drawn, routes plotted, and roles assigned. It felt like old times, the rhythm of preparation and anticipation rekindling something deep within me. Later, as I lay in bed, the weight of everything settled over me. The stakes were higher than ever, and the scars I carried, both visible and unseen, felt heavier in the quiet darkness. Yet, for the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. This was more than a mission. It was a chance to reclaim something I thought I'd lost. The belief that no matter how broken the world might seem, there was always a way forward. As the first light of dawn broke through the window, I rose with newfound purpose. The fight ahead would be brutal, but it was a fight worth taking for Ralph, for the team, and for the chance to finally put the past to rest. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. And I was ready. For more videos like and subscribe my channel Life Black Aspect.